Should you, as an age group triathlete, be looking at doing VO2 max and lactate threshold testing to get fitter and faster and achieve those ever precious goals? Well, I'm Josh, an age group triathlete based here in London, and a few months ago I had the opportunity to do sub-maximal and maximal, so lactate and VO2 testing up in the north of England at Loughbourough University. And today I thought I'd talk you through my experience, how beneficial I found it, how much it cost me, and whether or not I think it's worth it for an aspiring or competitive age group triathlete. But before I tell you whether or not I think it was worth it, let's just cover exactly what I mean when I say sub-maximal and maximal testing. Now we hear kind of lactate threshold, VO2, all of those kind of things just banded around, but I think it's really important to kind of clarify what we're talking about before we discuss kind of how beneficial the data that you get in those tests are. So let's start off by talking about sub-maximal testing, which makes up the bulk of the testing in which I participated in. Sub-maximal testing is simply a protocol which tests everything below your maximal amount of oxygen uptake. The most common test methodology, and the one that I partook in, is very simply the participant does 6-minute intervals, starting at a relatively easy and steady pace and working to above their lactate threshold. Typically a participant will get around 1 minute break in between these, where their lactate will be taken and will also be measuring their respiratory gases when they are doing the test. By taking those gases during the test and lactate measurements before and after, we get 3 main beneficial measurements from the sub-maximal test. First off, we get our blood lactate curve, and that's generally not going to mean very much to most people, but using that we can derive the 3 basic training zones which make up most kind of training zone models when looking at scientific literature. The first one being below the first lactate threshold, or the point at which the body starts to kind of generally produce lactate, and you see a small uptick in blood lactate at that point. And the second zone in between the first lactate threshold and the second lactate threshold. The second one is kind of the one that everyone thinks of, which is the point at which your body can no longer get rid of the lactate that your body is producing, and so we see a massive spike in blood lactate. And the third training zone is everything beyond that point. By having that lactate curve and having those 3 training zones is a real key for a lot of what we do in endurance sport. The second key measurement we get from our sub-maximal test is our efficiency, whether it be running or cycling or even swimming. If you're doing a test like that, we can kind of figure out exactly how much oxygen you are using to create or generate a specific velocity. And because the scientific community have done loads of these tests, we have an understanding of exactly what is good and what is bad. And if you have a poorer efficiency, meaning you use more oxygen to move a certain velocity than the average, that might be a really key avenue for you to improve, because you're essentially going to gain back some oxygen to improve your velocity in a very basic sense. And the third one, which not all tests do, but the test that I participated in did, is your fuel utilization. So by analysing the gases that you're breathing out, they can essentially tell how much of the energy you're using is coming from carbohydrates and how much is coming from fats. And while you run at those different speeds at the sub-maximal test, they can essentially see when you start burning more carbohydrate than you do those fats, and that can really help to inform fueling choices, especially in longer or ultra distance endurance events. On to the maximal test now, and there are a few different ways that I've seen these done. However, I think the one that I did is likely the one that people have seen the most, and that is you start at a kind of pretty steady pace, so typically just below LT2 or your second lactate threshold. And at set intervals, so for me it was every 1 minute, the treadmill incline increases by 1%. And that's going to keep happening 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 7, 8, 9%, which is where I got to. before you physically cannot run anymore and you basically fall over. Now, luckily you are typically tied into a harness, so you're not going to hurt yourself, but it is a pretty brutal experience. And you are just going as hard as you physically can until you literally cannot take another step. And during that whole process, again, we've got the mask on our face, measuring our gases, and pretty much the main thing that we're aiming to get in the super maximal test is our VO2 max, or the maximum amount of oxygen your body can utilize. But why is this beneficial? Why, as an age group triathlete like me or you, would you consider doing a lactate threshold and VO2 set of tests? Because they're not free, and we'll get on to whether or not they're worth it in a minute, but at least for me, the main benefits are as follows. It is really those training zones. As an age group triathlete, I am fundamentally limited by time. It's probably the most precious thing that I have around work and around spending time with friends and family. Having enough time to train is probably one of the hardest challenges that we all face. And so when you are limited in time, you need to make sure that the training you're doing is specific. And part of that specificity isn't just your training structure or making sure it's relevant to the race you're doing. It's making sure that if you're doing a threshold session, you are at threshold. If you are doing a base session or an LT1 session, you are at LT1. If you're doing a VO2 max session, you are at VO2. You get the point. By ensuring that you are actually training in the zones that you are aiming to target in your training, you make it significantly more beneficial, so you can really utilize the limited time you have and I have as an age group triathlete. Secondly is around fueling. Now, I'm only doing 70.3s at the moment, but fueling is still a massive part of endurance sport, and especially half and full distance triathlon. Knowing exactly how much fats and how much carbohydrates I'm using, and having an understanding of how much I need to take in to make sure that I'm not running out of energy at different velocities, is incredibly beneficial and removes a lot of the risk there is in endurance sport. And the third thing is being able to target my specific weaknesses, or your specific weaknesses. By testing, we not only gain all of this base information, but we understand right at that time where you are weak. Maybe your VO2 is quite low and your threshold is quite high as a proportion of that. Maybe it's the other way around and your VO2 is really high but your threshold's really low. You know the type of training that you need to focus on right now to make the biggest gains. And again, as a time-limited age group triathlete, knowing how to spend your time effectively is incredibly beneficial. And look, I've talked about the benefits. I'm just going to say I really think it was worth it. Here in the UK, tests is for a single sport are typically around £200. Now, that is a lot of money, and I'm incredibly privileged to have the opportunity to be able to do that recently. However, for me, it's almost a no-brainer, because if you compare that to the amount of time that I spend training and the amount of benefit I could get from training and the improved benefit I'm going to get by it being more specific, it really pays off. And I think it's a better investment than a slightly more aero this, a slightly different running shoe there. I think it's a really good investment of a triathlete's expenses. But you might disagree with me, and if you do, especially if you disagree with me, I'd love to hear your opinion down in the comments. I'd love to have a conversation there, because my opinion might not be the most common. However, that's it for this video. If you want more triathlon, running, cycling, swimming, age group content, and you enjoyed this video, please make sure to hit that like button and subscribe down below. Until the next one, I'll see you then.